Hey, Kelly, how are you today?
Hey, doing well. How are you?
Good, good. It's nice to virtually meet you.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, so far it's just the two of us. I've got this is my first one of these book club meetings. So I've had 8 people register. So hopefully, not to diminish your being here, but hopefully
Hopefully, it's
there's,
more than me. I have not finished the book. I just came across it on Tuesday.
yeah.
Downloaded it on Audible, have gotten a couple hours into it, but I thought, well, I'll still jump on and see if there's any nuggets I can glean from the meeting. And I've
Yeah.
already bought next month's book so I can have that read in time and join next month.
Great.
So,
Well, that's so exciting. Yeah, I kind of tripped over this. I'm probably one of Amazon's best customers in the entire world. And so that I always get I'm always on their website. So I saw the book club thing and I was like, oh gosh, I love real book clubs, in-person book
mhm.
clubs, but what a cool concept it might be to use this for nonprofit professionals to talk about things and to learn together. And I thought, let's see if this works. So
Absolutely.
I'm excited that you're excited about it. I ordered my copy of next month's book today because I thought, oh, I should have had a copy of it for the meeting. I could have held it up, but I'm excited about that one too. I think that one looks like I've always worked for smaller, not well, but one exception, but pretty
Mhm.
much smaller nonprofits. And that's who I work with now mostly. And so I think there's going to be some good stuff in that too. Um, but yeah, I enjoyed this book. I'm gonna just chat a little bit and see if anybody else joins us, and if not,
Sure.
we can just kind of go through and see what you've thought so far. I've got some questions and stuff to help lead the conversation, and I'm recording this so we can put it out there for anybody that wasn't able to join us, and they can just listen to our expert feedback on what
Okay,
we read.
perfect. That sounds good.
Um, but yeah, I'd love to just get to know you a little bit since it's just the two of us here so far.
Yeah, absolutely, sure. So I spent about 23 years in healthcare leadership and gosh, 2021 left my leadership role. I think after COVID, so many of us got burned out for lots of different reasons, but I left my leadership role and I switched completely over into a sales role, which was really different. So I worked for 2 years for a senior living community and for a nationally known one, but I had a district or a region within my state and worked with families, guided them through the steps in finding senior living, and did a lot of business development. Sales can burn you out very, very quickly, right? I
Mhm.
loved the job, but it was very demanding
Mhm.
and hard to balance that with a husband and kids and all these other things. So, left that role in May of this year to start my own business. And
Nice.
so I've been business consulting and coaching and grant writing since then. And I had done a lot of grant writing for the hospital system I had worked for.
Mhm.
We were a nonprofit, and I had sat on a lot of boards and foundations and things within our county and had been a grant writer for them as well. So it's something I've been doing for a long, long time. So that's kind of
Yeah.
how I've landed here. So,
Yeah. Well, then I'm absolutely thrilled to connect with you because that's what I do.
mhm.
Grant writing is my primary focus, and I work with nonprofit organizations across the country. As I said, mostly I think the ones that are going to be really interested in next month's book, those small to mid-range nonprofits. The
Mhm.
healthcare is one of those nonprofit niches that I have not really had much exposure to, and I'm kind of in awe of their ability and healthcare ability to secure really large grants and really impactful grants, and just how that's kind of a different beast unto itself when it comes to grant
Yeah.
writing. But work with all different kinds of missions and budget sizes and organizations across the country, and coming off of a career in nonprofit fundraising here in the metro Atlanta area, just all different types, mostly social service and higher education,
Mhm.
which I think prepared me well for grant writing because it's kind of across the board, right? All the basic human needs kind of things. And then higher education, which, college presidents have a different fundraising need every 3 days, it feels like.
Right.
So I think that prepared me well for grant writing. But I thought that this would just be a really fun opportunity to connect with different nonprofits. And yeah, I started Just Right Grants in 2017. So amazingly been doing this now for over 6 years and just loving it. Same kind of thing. I was working full time and had a husband and one kid at the time. And now we've got three. And this just allows me to be able to be home and, be with
Yes.
them and still do what I love and contribute in a way that I feel like best suits my talents. So I'm excited to connect with you from one grant writer to
Yes.
the next.
I am
Yeah.
too.
And so I'm excited to hear your perspective as a business consultant on this book. And I guess we can just go ahead and dive right in.
Sure.
And talk about the different truths that were in this. I thought it was interesting how the author built upon each one, how we started out with that mission. And I've got kind of a breakdown here of each one of those truths and wanted to talk about it. With the first one being that be fanatical about mission. And I think that's probably something, and feel free to jump in at any time, but I think that's something that we kind of all know, but just kind of inherently know that you would want that in a leader. But the way that he broke it down as to what that actually means was really interesting to me about, whether or not the leader of your organization is fanatical about that mission. And looking back over my career and the executive directors or the CEOs that I worked with, and kind of holding them up to that lens. Were they fanatical about mission, or were they very good at executing the basic tasks of being an executive director?
Right. I actually thought of an example from probably 20 years ago, a director that I worked for at the hospital. In that role, I was in the wellness and community education space. And so one of the things, one of the hats I wore is I organized all the community fitness that our hospital provided. And we had certain guidelines about pre-purchasing classes and whatever, right? And so some people weren't, following the rules per se. And so I can remember so clearly, and I thought of it while I was listening to this book, my director came to me and he said, what's the goal of having these community fitness classes? And I'm like, oh, well, because we want people to be healthier, or we want blah, 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 reduction in diabetes and heart disease. And he says, so if we're being so strict about these rules, about them prepaying and whatever, he's like, are we deterring them from coming, or are we making it easier for people to come? And I'm like, well, we're not making it easier. It's like, so which one's fitting our mission better? And he walked me through, and I was a pretty young leader at that time. And that has always stuck with me, that what is the outcome you're looking for? Move all these other things that are obstacles or rules, or, certain policy and procedure you can't sidestep.
Yeah.
But some you, right?
Yeah.
And so that made me think of him and what a great leader he was to me for a number of years.
Yeah. And that goes really well with the example that they shared in the book with the safety. I think it's later on in another chapter where the new CEO has come on board and she's made safety their priority, and the policies and procedures that go into place with that, and how she had to let that staff person go because of that. But ultimately, that ties to their mission. And that's something too in grant writing that I noticed a lot through this book, and fundraising in general is, I host a lot of webinars, and we've got a grant writing boot camp that we use or that we offer. And I talk a lot in any of those sessions about, if it doesn't tie back to your mission, or if it doesn't help support your mission, it's got to go, and having how easy it is to do that sort of mission creep, where you're straying away from it, and how evident that is to a grant maker or a fundraising stakeholder. Almost immediately you can see that. And as a grant writer, if I'm writing something that is square peg round hole, it's easy to recognize that, because it just doesn't fit. But it's hard when you're inside, that I think you can get caught up in all that stuff, and all the regulations and all of the rules and the processes that that he says in the book. In truth number 2, you've got to stabilize and fix those systems and processes. But like you said, are there extraneous ones that are just there because that are creating barriers to actually executing your mission? So I think, looking back again over the people that I've worked with, I thought it was interesting to think about the people that weren't passionate about mission, and maybe were just there because it was a job, and how that sort of affected the culture of the organization. Like, you could tell who was burnout and who was caught up in the day-to-day operations, and the passion wasn't there for the cause anymore, or it hadn't been there in the first place. and how that person, particularly if they're in a leadership role, can change the environment with that. And it, it kind of ripples down to everybody, or the opposite being true. You got somebody that comes in and is so fired up, passionate about it, like you can't help but jump into that passion, that yay rah, let's go team kind of approach. And looking back with hindsight on that, to think, okay, well, maybe it wasn't so much that I hated my job or whatever. It was just that there wasn't that sense of passion there as a community culture. Yeah. So what did you think about initially in the first truth about them hiring the passionate executive director over the experienced executive director?
Yeah, so that really resonated with me because I have always been the kind of leader that has hired for attitude, because I can teach aptitude. I can teach you to do anything I need you to do, but I can't teach you to have that fire and that passion and the right attitude about coming to work every day. So as I was, driving along yesterday, listening to the Audible book, I was like, rooting for her, like wanting her to get the job, like, because that's, I guess, my mentality in hiring as well. So I was really glad that they selected her. And I think that that's one thing that's really hard to make shine through in a resume when you're applying for a role. So maybe all of your qualifications don't exactly check every box they're looking for, but you bring a certain kind of energy to a room and excitement to a group that you lead, but it's hard to portray that. So it was beneficial that she had worked in that company for a long time. They knew her. But yeah, I was excited about their hire. And although I haven't gotten all the way through the book, I feel like they made the right hire. So
yeah. And I thought about that too. It's like, how many people now with AI, with resumes and things like that, how many people that are the Helen of this book that maybe don't get that interview opportunity to let that shine through, because, there's so many, I'm in a group on Facebook of women in business and marketing and communications in the metro Atlanta area. And they talk about that a lot. Like, how do I get my resume through these portals so that I can get in front of someone? And yeah, I think maybe there's a little bit of that lost human aspect to that she had the benefit of working for the organization. So they knew, and like thinking back over my own interviews and stuff where I knew I wanted that job so passionately, but I focused in my interview on this, trying to boost my own credibility as far as skills goes, and may have diminished that passion a little bit. So maybe I didn't come across as so over the top. And thinking back, like, maybe I could have increased my likelihood of getting that job if I had let that part shine through a little bit too. Even if I wasn't necessarily, I always seem to feel that way. And they talk about that later in the book too, about how women, particularly when they're asked about their own leadership skills, tend to respond in a way that's more critical of themselves. And is that an opportunity for women to kind of self-assess there and get some feedback there to help them understand their own strengths when it comes to leadership. The one that really, the second truth that really resonated with me, because I've been in leadership roles before and I have had to do this. I pulled a quote from each truth, and this one, that transformational leaders always believe the door is open. They begin making needed changes almost immediately. And one of the roles that I was in prior to launching Just Right Grants had a situation where one of those decisions needed to be a staff person. And coming in the door as the newcomer and having to set that as one of the first things that I did in an executive director role was so daunting. And I put it off for so long and tried everything possible to avoid it, and provided probably 10 to 15 extra chances than I probably should have. And so reading this, I was kind of trying to be more like, I guess, unbiased from my own experience of like, easier said than done kind of while I was reading this. And I don't know if you made it through the second truth or not. Have you had the opportunity to read that one?
I'm just about to the end of it.
Yeah. That one is hard for me to kind of leaders must be vigilant about addressing what is not working. I was really good at, hey, this system is broken. Hey, we need a new database. Hey, we need to start, if our donors are sending in gifts, we need to be sending them receipts within a certain amount of time, like things like that. I was really good at coming on board and addressing those things. And also things like, that's outdated. That's not going to, that's not a value of our time. But then when it came to staff, that was
People.
the hardest. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And not even just for the person that it was going to impact, but for the rest of the people. I was like, I don't want them to come in and being like, oh gosh, this Melanie is like, coming in here ready to take everybody out at the kneecaps. And so I was really concerned about that. I eventually it worked itself out without me necessarily having to pull the Band-Aid off. But it was still very hard because I knew within days of coming on board it needed to happen. And I'm sure you've probably been in similar situations in leadership roles.
I have been. And you're right. You don't want to come in like this big bad new executive director or boss or supervisor who's, coming to tear everything up. But sometimes it's really obvious where there are those systematic issues or the people issues, either one. And I probably did a lot like you did, gave maybe more chances than what was warranted. But at least I knew for myself and it was documented for others to see that I, gave all those options and opportunities for remediation, gave the extra training, gave all those opportunities for them to step up and stand in their light if that was what they chose to do. And if they didn't, then it was, time to help them find a role that they'd be better suited in. Right. But no, it's hard to do.
Yeah. And there's a section in that chapter that talks about how keeping those people on board can actually be, in a sense, a misuse of donations because they're supported by those contributions. And if they aren't positively impacting mission, are they, creating a situation where you could be held accountable to a donor because of that? And, having never really thought about that, they just get a paycheck from the organization, right? But where does that money come from? And if they're not helping to essentially make that positive change that your mission is supposed to be doing, again, everything rolling back up into the mission. One of the things that really struck me in that chapter 2 was this quote: leaders must be vigilant about addressing what is not working. Once something is broken or obsolete and not addressed, it becomes the status quo. And I worked for a higher education organization that we lived by the mantra of, well, that's the way we've always done it. And I, even as a very young professional, that just made my skin crawl. Like every time I heard it, I'm like, why would we continue to do it that way? If people are telling us, and again, probably that whole, you're never a prophet in your own land. But, if we're learning that there are new and different and better ways for us to do this, why would we continue to do the old ways and expect anything different? Our fundraising goals would increase every year, but we'd still do the same things and just kind of hope that people gave us more money, right? That people like, oh, they have a 10% increase on their annual campaign. Sure, I'll write you an extra $100. That's not how it works. And so that really resonated with me, and it became very clear to me in the positions that I was in how that can be such a boat anchor to organizations, to fundraising departments, and it can prevent you from really being transformational.
I would agree. And I even thought too, kind of a little bit different twist on that when we talk about status quo. I know one of the roles that I stepped into was taking over for a manager who had been moved to a new area. And he had very low expectations for that department for years. And so, and going back to that, the employee I was just referring to that I had to give a lot of chances to, in a way, I kind of felt bad for her because she'd never been expected to do anything else.
Yeah,
because
it's probably like a what?
Yes, the leader just was status quo. He came in, he did his job, whatever. So in a way, it was almost like not her fault, kind of, right? But we gave her lots of opportunities to improve. But yeah, he embodied the status quo too as a leader. And so that was detrimental to the whole department.
a victim of circumstances a little
Yeah,
bit. Yeah.
truly did.
Yeah. Let's see. I did like how he talked about at the beginning, and he talks about it throughout the book too, about how transformational leaders need to develop people that have the skills and the knowledge and the judgment to solve the day-to-day problems over the long term. That even though this individual may come in as that problem solver initially, the ultimate long-term goal needs to be that that's not his or her continuous role. And I've been there too, where the executive director is so caught up in the day-to-day operations years after they should be, and can't move out of that rut to truly be the CEO or the executive director and in a management or oversight of those functions, and how that can kind of diminish their ability to truly be in that role, but also diminish the people around them who want to step into those roles of being the program director or the director of development and actually running the day-to-day operations of those programs. So I thought that was, again, looking back in hindsight to see, yeah, I can clearly see how that changed our ability to really exceed what we'd done and, to move forward and upward. And the ruthless leadership pull out was interesting to me too, to think about, because my definition of ruthless would be initially what he said, brutal or cruel, and thinking about cutting somebody's job within the first week of coming on board, but meaning that the mission really has to supersede everything, and that's where you're ruthless,
right?
In that you can't wait to address those things. That has to be a priority. And that this, having seen leaders be lenient in that, particularly I think in nonprofits, I think it's probably more acceptable to be that ruthless leaders maybe in a for-profit business. I haven't worked for a whole lot of for-profit organizations to have firsthand experience there, but I think there's kind of this mindset of that nonprofit leaders maybe are a little bit more warm and fuzzy and loving and caring and kind. And so they wouldn't have that in them to do that, to be that kind of person. If you are so philanthropically minded that you're working for a nonprofit, but I think that can be a detriment as much as it can be a benefit for the passion. I think that if you don't have the ability to truly be that leader where the buck stops, then that can really hold back the organization.
And I've worked for both for-profit and nonprofit leaders, and yeah, I think that would also echo what my experience has been, is that the for-profit leadership was definitely more ruthless, right, than the nonprofit leadership that I've worked for. But in that same token, they did it with a mark of kindness. Like, they were kind, but it was like, okay, the buck stops here. Like, you've got to meet these numbers, kind of thing, where I think there was more wiggle room in the nonprofit world.
Yeah.
Be a little softer, a little more gentle about that.
Yeah. And as thinking from, I kind of feel like I sometimes ride the line in between the two as a small business owner, very small micro business owner. And then having had the experience working for nonprofits, but also now working with nonprofits, and in a lot of cases with nonprofit executive directors, thinking about it from my perspective as a small business owner and manager of staff, that, sometimes I find myself and, get feedback where it's like, you just got to let that person go. Like they're either not the experience you thought they had, or they're not contributing in a way that you need them to. And and I think about it from my business of like, okay, I want my business to survive. Like, this is my baby. Like, I have to have this, and I can't have anything that pulls that down or jeopardizes that. So I think about it from the business side, but then my nonprofit brain is like, well, I want this person to grow, and I want this person to, I don't want to hurt their feelings, and I want them to be part of this. And I think, it's hard to balance those two kind of, things talking to me from either shoulder here. So I can understand how that can be hard in a nonprofit setting. And two, like in the book, the reaction of the staff person that she had to let go of, like, I've been here forever, I'm so invested in this, I'm going to call the media,
Right.
and, you know, I'm going to get an article in the newspaper about how awful you are. But in reality, you know, he was setting the organization up for potential failure. So in the truth number 3, establish a mission driven strategy. This was a really long chapter, so when you get there
Okay.
in the audible version, it's very long, but I liked the initial quote was, transformational leaders succeed by clearly articulating and aligning organizations on a thoughtful, evidence-informed strategy for how the organization will pursue its mission. An effective strategy provides extraordinary clarity about how the organization achieves its mission. I thought this chapter particularly was very relevant. I think, I hope that I'll be interested to see if you agree from a grant writing perspective, that this is really grant writing bread and butter in here. If you don't have that strategy in place for how you're going to achieve the mission, then you're not ready to start submitting grants. You're probably not even really ready to do any fundraising yet.
Right.
Because if you can't convince me, your grant writer, that you're going to do it, then you're probably not going to convince somebody with a checkbook at a foundation that's never heard of you before. And I found it interesting. He says that a strategy is not the same as a strategic plan. And you know, kind of dividing those two things in my head as a fundraising professional, like, I always talk in terms of what is your strategic plan, but the strategy ultimately being, you know, how do you develop that compelling story, which my note was grant writing, you know, grant writing and fundraising, you need a compelling story
You do.
about how the organization makes a difference, and that you share this over and over again across the organization and with every stakeholder. And it made me think of organizations that do this really well in their marketing internally and externally, and how you know, they're using the same words and the same mantras and the same images and colors and logos, and how nonprofits do that really well in a campaign. You know, bigger nonprofits, when they're in a campaign. I worked for Emory University, and we were in a $1 billion campaign when I worked there, which I used to joke and say, you know, they actually say billion, like not like Dr. Evil. They're really talking like billions of dollars. And everything was about that campaign all the time. And what that meant for us internally, as far as what the expectations were, and what that meant externally for students and stakeholders, and how it would transform the Emory University experience for everybody that was involved, should we be successful. And they were successful with that campaign. And it was everywhere. It was in our email signatures. It was in every meeting we had. It was in every piece of communication. The campaign logo was everywhere. You couldn't have stopped anybody on that campus from whatever position they were in, and they wouldn't have known that we were in a campaign. And I thought they did that brilliantly, because it creates that team aspect, right? It's not just the fundraising department that's part of this. It's faculty and staff are a part of this. And, you know, everybody from every rung of the organizational chart is a part of this campaign in one way, shape, or form, and just creates that cohesive, comprehensive team.
Yes, everybody's got the same message.
Yep. And then I liked how he, this is something that I'm challenged with a lot of times with relatively newer nonprofits. I like how the author broke down what elements your mission statement should include. And I think we probably read mission statements so often that we don't recognize these elements until they're not there.
Right.
So when I'm reading these, I was reading over all of the examples, and he gave a plethora of examples, probably 15 different examples, and then broke them down that they should include, you know, the difference the organization makes, who the organization serves, and then how it makes a difference. And when he did that, and I was like, yeah, you can clearly see it. And I think that's something that newer nonprofits are sometimes challenged with, that they just think about the difference that they want to make. and the thing that they're passionate about, but breaking that down into who are they serving and how are they serving is where there can sometimes be a speed bump. And it's something that I talk about a lot in the grant writing boot camp. And again, in the webinars of, if you don't have that solidified, that's kind of like, the epicenter of everything. If you don't have that solidified, that's got to be your first step. And everybody has to be on the same page about the different elements of that. And how it rolls back up. Obviously, everything's got to roll back up into that. I like too in this chapter, and again, as a grant writer, I think you will too, that he talks about results. That the transformational leader needs to be the person who's defining how you're going to get better as an organization. How are you going to drive performance and accountability around those actions? And then how are you going to communicate the impact that those activities have and the picture of the value that the organization creates? And I think that's something too that as a grant writer, I try to push that to nonprofits of, there could be 10 other homeless shelters in your metro region. What value do you bring individually and uniquely that the 9 or 10 others aren't doing, because you're probably all asking for funding from the same funder. So if you're all giving the same message and you can't show what your unique value is, then you're going to get lost in the noise. And you need something that brings your organization to the top of that pile. And then if you're doing that well, and you've got a tracking mechanism in place for how to show that impact, then grant reporting is a breeze.
Yes.
Coming back to them and saying, yeah, this is what we said we were doing. This is where your money came in, and this is what we did with it. Then, you've already got all those systems in place. And I think grant reporting sometimes gives a lot of nonprofit professionals heartburn because they're scared of what they're going to be asked to report back on, not necessarily because they're hiding anything, but just because they don't know what to track. And so if you lead with that, then it just it's almost a reflex response. It's something that you're already doing.
It reminds me of when I worked for the senior living communities. The language that we used is, there's so much competition in assisted living. And so what makes us different and better? And so sometimes when I'm working with clients, I'll use that with them, like use the example of the homeless shelter. There's, 9 or 10 other ones doing the same thing. What makes you different and better? Why should this funder pay attention to the work you're doing? How is it more impactful in a different way than the others? So.
Yep. And like we talk about too, there's, 1.5 million nonprofits in the United States. Somebody's doing something similar to what you're doing.
Yes.
You've got to be able to, differentiate yourself. And if you can't, it's going to be hard to justify a need for that funding. And because a funder, a savvy donor or savvy grant maker, if it were me, my thought would be, why did you open a new one? If you can't answer that question, why did you open a new homeless shelter? And if you can't answer that question in a different way, then maybe partnering with that one, the other 9 that already existed may have been a better approach than starting something new. And I think that's something that newer nonprofit executives are really challenged with. Particularly if there are other service organizations that are doing something similar, like you said. Truth number 4, execution drives results. The quote that I liked at the beginning of that one was, strategy is useless unless it can be executed. And I've been in that endless circle of pain where we're just planning, and nothing ever happens. And I'm just like, we've got to land this plane. Like, we've got to do something. And he said, transformational leaders relentlessly communicate strategy at every opportunity. It was kind of a duplicate, I felt like, of the last one where we talked about, messaging, but, talking about whether or not your entire staff is on the same page about strategy and mission, and is it shared through everything? And another quote I liked was, what gets measured gets done. Because particularly, again, in grant writing and fundraising, we've got to have that data. It's great to have those heartwarming impact stories, and that's an important part of what we do in fundraising, because we are all human, even at foundations, and the federal government grant makers are all humans at the end of the day. But we also have to be able to justify our existence with that data. And if you can't, you're going to struggle in competition with the ones that can and do. And then talking about, how often does the organization assess that strategy? And I think it can be easy to spend so much time developing a strategy or a strategic plan and processes and procedures. And then you kind of like take a deep breath when you're done. And you're like, okay, well, that's done. Now let's move on to something else. And then it's been 2 or 3 years and you're like, hey, what happened to that strategic plan we put together in 2021? And, nobody's really been checking up on it, and everybody's kind of been floating, doing their own thing. And that can really lead to, again, to that mission creep that I talk about a lot. One thing, again, that struck me in this section was the ends versus means goals. And it's towards the end of the chapter. He talks about that end goals fulfill your mission. And I've worked with a lot of nonprofits that focus on the means goals, the how are we going to get there internally and functionally, instead of how are we going to have this positive impact. And I think, having talked so much about mission, by the time you get to this, it makes more sense, that making sure that the impact is the goal and not the functional task related aspects of getting there being the goal. Did we send out our fall mailer? Did we attend 4 chamber events this year? Did we engage 100 new donors? And thinking about it too, from a grant writing perspective, every nonprofit I talk to, and I'll ask them, what do you need money for? The first response is general operating, and that's pretty standard across the board. And, I always give them a smile and tell them they are not alone in that. But we have to think about, and it's certainly things we can get grant funding for. But when you say it in the approach where you're looking at it as an ends goal, if you say, with more general operating revenue, we can add an additional staff person for client intake, and then that allows us to increase our capacity and better serve the community. When you can do it with that impact as that last part of it,
right?
That's what grant makers want. They don't want to pay your power bill necessarily, unless that's something that they do. But, they want that impact portion. And I think when you're an executive director who's looking at the bottom line and maybe getting a little panicky about where you're going to get the money to do all this and where you're going to get the capacity and the staff to do all this, and you've got to think about it from that business perspective to stay afloat, it's harder to turn that on its head and look at it from an impact perspective. And I try to help nonprofits see that. How do we frame this? You and I both know that you need staff and you need to be able to pay them. But how do I turn that in a way that shows that staff person's addition to your team is going to positively impact the lives of the people that you serve? It's not just, we need it because I'm overwhelmed and I can't do all this stuff myself. While we know that's true, we've got to frame it in that way because that's how they want to be philanthropic.
Yes.
And I don't think for-profit businesses ever have that problem. That's a unique to nonprofit issue, because I think for-profit businesses, it's just that bottom line. It's just, we got to make money. We got to have more sales or whatever it is that they do. And in this case, you've got to have that intangible impact aspect of it being the goal, the end goal, as he says. So that was just a little snippet in there. And I was like, that's so profound to me and so unique to the nonprofit sector, I think. And then truth number 5 was continue to grow as a leader. Transformational leaders are able to adapt and change their focus as their organization evolves and grows. Evolving in this way is difficult. And we talked about this a little earlier. You know, have you ever worked with one of those executive directors who's just stuck in that day-to-day operations phase? And how did that impact your job? Or were you ever in that role where you just were stuck in that and couldn't get out of that, you know, hamster wheel of the day-to-day stuff? And then, you know, how has your executive director evolved as the nonprofit grows? And he says the most successful organizations build a culture that supports feedback and honest dialogue. And this begins with a process to provide a 360-degree feedback. I have never once worked in an organization that did 360-degree feedback, and I think I would have loved it. I do it with my team because I've never run a business before, right? I'm still consider myself pretty young in running a business. And so if the people that I work with can offer me feedback on how to do this better, why wouldn't I want to hear that? But I think that there's a lot of people that, and he talks about it in this one, it's hard to hear that sometimes. And you have to, in order to be a transformational leader, you have to be really open to that and willing to be vulnerable to it, or the organization is going to get stuck. And it's going to affect the climate of the organization and in turn prevent you from continuing to transform that nonprofit. Have you ever done 360 feedback?
I have. And one of the clients that I work with right now for some consulting and coaching, they have a new executive director, a new administrator, and she's new to an administrator role. And I always tell her, you have to take your ego out of it. Like, you're going to get this feedback and it's going to feel really personal, like an attack. Like, why would they say that about me? But it's not. Take your ego out of it and say, okay, what can I take from this that's going to help me do better at my role, serve these residents better, and you know, stay in line with our mission and, you know, move us forward.
Yeah.
So we always talk about like taking ego out.
Yep. And I think too, if you go into it, you know, thinking about that, this is all about the mission. It's not about me, Melanie. It's about how do I, in my role as executive director, continue to promote and advance the mission. And if there's things that I need to adjust in how I'm doing that, then it's not necessarily, you know, nobody's going to come in there and just be like, you're absolutely terrible. And that's going to be the first time you're going to hear it. I mean, you know, it's just, it's going to be things like, you know, things that I wish that I could have said to an executive director of, you know, my life would be easier. My job would be easier if you communicated with me more frequently. You know, we only meet once a month. That's not enough. You know, and I'm not aware. I work better when I know what the expectations are of me and the deadlines. So I'm a good grant writer. I like to work in that framework. You know, I had a previous supervisor who just kind of was like the clockmaker. You know, he would wind us up and let us go. And that did not work well for me because I always felt like I was spinning out of control, out in the orbit somewhere of, I don't know, am I going to get into a review situation? And he's going to be like, well, you didn't meet these 5 expectations that I didn't know about.
Right.
And so that was hard for me and wasn't given the opportunity to offer that feedback. Was very young in my career. Looking back now, I probably would offer that feedback. But thinking about that too, you know, creating that environment where that is welcome and accepted and constructive feedback is viewed in an approach that it isn't, you know, a roast.
Right.
It's truly meant to be constructive and positive for the organization and not focused on the challenges or obstacles the individual is facing. He talks about too, people that have a specialty in being this transformational leader, but that's where it stops. And having been in higher education, I've seen that so many times because we would have interim presidents come in or interim vice presidents that would come in and help us get from point A to point B. We may have been stuck at point A. and really transform the organization. And I remember being in my role and thinking, wow, he was just amazing, right? We came from what felt like the dark ages to now we are in this amazing place. And then that person would move on. And I'd be like, well, dang it, man, I wish he would stay because he did such an amazing job. Wouldn't he want to see the fruits of his labor?
Mhm.
And now, having read this and thinking about it with hindsight again as an older professional and thinking that was his or her specialty. That's
Right.
what they do. They go from place to place. They help get over the hurdles. They can come in and be kind of a third party.
Mhm.
They don't have any affiliations to anybody or any pre-existing relationships or anything like that. They can come in and say, hey, you got to go. This has got to go. We got to add this. We got to do that. And the people that, can't get on board with that. I remember looking back, they didn't stick around through
Right.
that transition, and they didn't like the growing pains of it. And
Mhm.
so they moved on. And so that was interesting to me to think about that, of how they got us out of the rut and set us on a course for positivity, and then went and did that somewhere else and let somebody come in who wanted to then oversee that and,
Right.
and come in where that part of the process was done. And so looking back again in retrospect of thinking, okay, well, that's why he or she left. That was their job and they knew that was their role and they enjoyed it. And, I hope felt successful in it and hopefully looked back and thought, yeah, look at that school. They're doing really great. And I was a part of that.
Right.
Yeah. And then chapter 6 kind of, chapter 6, yeah, he kind of wraps it up a little, in there, and he talks about the road ahead, trends and challenges that will shape the future. And I think, I liked this book was written post-COVID.
Mhm.
As I was reading it, I was like, he talks about the pandemic in it somewhat, but I thought particularly when we're talking about trends and challenges for nonprofits, talking about how workforce challenges and the changing definition of work is something that transformational leaders really need to consider. And I think this isn't going to be news to anybody, but the primary thing he talks about is salaries and benefits. Nonprofits are notorious for having very little salaries and benefits to
Mhm.
offer employees. And I think, he talks about that that's an absolute need. There's such a competitive workforce right now. There's so many open positions. And that if you want to be competitive in those roles, you have to be competitive in the salaries and
For
benefits.
sure.
And thinking about too, not just investing in salaries and benefits, but professional development too. I think nonprofits, this may be a generalized statement, but the ones that I worked for were sometimes shy to invest in professional development. It can be very expensive.
Yes.
I've worked for leaders who were unfortunately nervous about investing in professional development because they thought that would inspire their best performing people to go somewhere else that they could make a little bit more money once they had that professional development. And I think, but I have worked for some leaders who have clearly said, my goal for you is to help you be the best version of you can be. And if that's here, that's great. If it's not, then, we'll utilize your expertise while you're here. And hopefully you leave this place a better place than it was when you started, and wish you the best. And so that always felt good to me as a staff person, that I wasn't just, a completer of tasks.
Right.
They actually valued me and my unique skill sets and what I could offer. Another thing they talk about is that we have to, as nonprofits, commit to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have to look at, particularly, I think, our boards. I'm challenged with this a lot of times with nonprofits too, when we will submit a grant application and the organization, their mission work is very connected to minority communities or people of color, and their board and their staff does not reflect that. And I know that that has impeded their ability with some funders to get grant awards because it is not a reflection of the communities that they serve. And I think that there's some growing pains there as we address diversity, equity, and inclusion as a nation. But I really do think that nonprofits could lead the charge there. And that it can be just, it can be mutually beneficial. And I don't mean that in a way as far as you can get more money if you have more people of color on your board. But I think there's so much value there in having that feedback from the different communities, and instead of kind of, dictating what this is going to be, really have a collaboration with representatives of the communities that you serve.
Yeah, I would agree.
And having a culture that's inclusive, nurturing, and empowering, and motivating. And I think that goes back to those leaders. It reminded me again of those leaders who said to me, go out and get the professional development that you want, learn, go get another degree, do everything, better yourself as much as you can and take advantage of those opportunities. And that empowered me to, usually I would be taking these classes and stuff, and I would learn something, and I would take, my notes would be specific to my role at that organization. So it's like, I can benefit this organization by learning this. It's not just benefiting me.
Right.
I can utilize these things that I'm learning as soon as I get back to the office. And then that they need to establish a pipeline of young people coming into entry-level positions. And then my note, I would have added a parentheses there for the book to say, and pay them a living wage. Entry-level positions, pay them a living wage. That's something in that one of those groups I'm in on Facebook, that people coming out of college, just saying, sharing what entry-level positions, requirements of entry-level positions are, and how the definition of entry-level has changed.
It has.
Where entry-level is requiring, 3 to 5 years of experience. And they're like, what? That's not entry-level. Like,
No.
That's experienced. And then what the salaries for those are. And it's hard to think about how do you navigate that as someone who's fresh out of college, and are you then kind of forced to have two jobs, and and forced into a situation where maybe you're very passionate about a nonprofit, but if their salary, like, are you willing to take a lesser salary? Or should we as nonprofit leaders be having the conversations with our donors that say, we need to invest in these people, because if they are passionate about the organization, and we know that people of that age range want to feel that connection, they want to feel in their jobs that they are giving back somehow, that's important to the generations that are now moving into professional roles.
Right.
And so I think nonprofits are well suited to meet that need that they have. But if we're not paying them, are they going to have to make a decision to not do something that they're really passionate about and may really be able to contribute to, because they just can't afford to live on what the salary is? He also talks about, how we do that, recruiting high school students and college students for paid internships, obviously, and having them, even individuals who have benefited from that organization or a similar organization, who can bring that passion on board. And then he talks about collaborations and partners being really the key. And I see this in grant writing all the time. Grant makers want to see that you're not operating in a silo, and that you are able to collaborate with other organizations. And I've looked at it previously as that you can better serve your clients because you're offering comprehensive, well, we don't do that, but here's our partner organization that does.
Right.
But also looking at it from capacity, if and that's what he talked about in the book, you're able to accomplish so much more and truly hit that impact goal when you're able to say, we're a homeless shelter and we offered him transitional housing. And then we've got this other nonprofit that's our partner that does job readiness or, workforce development. So he was able to get his resume, then he got a job. Like, the ripple effects of all of those collaborations to truly show how this individual moved from one point to another in his or her life. And then he talked for a few pages about business acumen being an important concept for nonprofit professionals to kind of embrace and thinking about that too. I've seen in a lot of nonprofit groups that I'm in, like nonprofit leaders saying that they're coming on board to run the nonprofit sort of like a for-profit, that, you know, thinking in terms of, you know, that business acumen and does that leadership style work in a nonprofit setting. You know, I don't see why it wouldn't.
Right.
But interesting to see, you know, over time, if that's something that more nonprofits and nonprofit leaders kind of adopt that mindset. Be interested to hear what you think about that, having been in both roles.
I wouldn't be surprised if the for-profit leadership styles creep more and more into not-for-profit, and especially because of what you just said, it's becoming more and more competitive. There are times right now, especially, you see more and more lean, where everybody's got to kind of buckle in tighter. And so having that for-profit mentality, I think, will help sometimes to run a little bit tighter ship, and also kind of meet the needs where that what do I want to say, where the competition comes in, right?
Yeah.
I think it's going to also serve that well.
Yeah. Yeah. And thinking about, I think just thinking of it in terms of competition is a for-profit mindset.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the book. In the beginning of the introduction, the author states the goal of this book is to provide a leadership model that enables nonprofit leaders to achieve profound impact on the lives of millions of people. And I'll be interested. I hope you'll keep in touch with me as you get through it and let me know if you think that that was the goal, or if he accomplished that goal. I think it's definitely interesting, having gone through the whole book, you know, not being a nonprofit executive director now myself. But I think, you know, it would be interesting if I were at a nonprofit and I had read this book and wasn't an executive director. Would I feel comfortable bringing this to my executive director? Would I be in a position where I could say, hey, I read this book and I feel like it could really help us transform this organization, and sharing it with him or her and getting their feedback about it? Would I feel comfortable looking back over some of my supervisors? I could tell you who I could do that with and who I couldn't have done it with.
Right.
But I think too, again, looking back over management positions that I had, there's a lot in this book that I could have implemented, strategies and concepts that I could have implemented in my leadership role that may not have affected the entire organization, but really may have positively impacted my department. That would have been relatively easy to do, particularly around the strategy planning, and does everything we do roll up into the mission? And maybe, you know, even as my department doing that may have had ripple effects into others that could have eventually, you know, kind of spiderwebbed to the whole organization. And then, you know, as I said, kind of my last wrap-up question would have been, would you have recommended this book to your executive director? Is this something that he or she would have been open to utilizing? And I think it'll be interesting. I'd love to, you know, I'm going to share this recording on our YouTube channel, and I would love if people commented on that, because I think that would be really interesting feedback for the author too, but particularly, you know, thinking in terms of, is your executive director open to that kind of feedback? And would you define your executive director as a transformational leader, or do they kind of fall into one of those other buckets that they mentioned in the book? So Kelly, I'm so glad to have met you. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you being the only one here and having this conversation with me. I've really enjoyed it.
Yes,
I love talking shop. Yeah, I love talking shop. I could do it all day. I don't think I ever turn off the fundraising part of my brain. I'm always thinking about things, but I'm excited about the little book of gold that we're going to do next month
too.
Yeah, I think that's going to be great. It's it looks like, you know, it's very highly reviewed, and it looks like it's going to be, it says it's a short guide, so I appreciate that too. This book I felt was a little long, and I don't know if you feel that just yet, but I feel like there's some repetition in this one that I was kind of like, oh, we probably could have cut that out and saved 3 or 4 pages, but
Right.
But overall, I felt it was good. And this one, I like that they mentioned it's practical step-by-step guide. I'm like, that's what I need. Practicality.
Right. Throw it in bullet points for me.
Yep.
Move it along.
And I like too in this book too, the 5 truths. I don't know if you've looked back there, but particularly all the resource guides, the resources in there, I think would be really helpful. I'm excited to kind of go through those too. I haven't gone through them just yet, but go through them and see if there's anything that, I can utilize for some of my clients, and particularly get a lot of questions about board development. So there's a whole section in there for board members. So I think that's going to be really interesting. But I hope to see you next month. I hope if you haven't already signed up for our e-newsletter.
I think that I have. Yes.
Oh, perfect. So I'm going to put one together here soon with the details of the next one of these, and hope to see you at next month, and look forward to talking to you about the little book of gold.
Great. Hey, thank you so much. It was great to meet you.
Kelly. Nice to meet you too. Have a great afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.